we're smoking a brisket on the Weber Searwood, and later on in the video I'm going to show you something that was quite surprising. I'm Johnny, you're watching A View to a Grill. It is 10:26 and I want to have this on the pit by 11 o'clock. And the first thing we need to do is to prepare our Weber Searwood. We're going to get our pellets into the Weber Searwood, and since this is going to be a long cook, I filled it all the way to the top. We're going to be smoking our brisket at 230 degrees today, about 10 degrees higher than I would normally go for a long, low and slow cook, because I'm trying to save an hour's worth of time. Now that our Weber Searwood is ready to go, let's make our rub. For our rub, we'll need 1 teaspoon of granulated garlic, 1 teaspoon of granulated onion, 1/4 cup of coarse ground black pepper, and a 1/4 cup of kosher salt. To make this easy, I have a little bowl with measurements already on it, and if we don't hit those perfectly, it'll be just fine. Now we can get all of those ingredients into a bowl, stir it up from the bottom up, and when I was done, I had a rub that looked like this. Now that our rub is done, let's prepare our brisket. Our brisket is coming in at over 14.5 pounds, which is the perfect size for about a 20 to 24 hour cook. Now before I get started trimming the brisket, I want to go ahead and inspect it. The first thing I notice is this huge hump. Now for some reason I didn't notice that when I was purchasing the brisket, but it's what we got now, so we're going to work with it. Also notice that the fat layer is pretty thin, so I won't have to be trimming any of that. And here's the reason why I purchased this brisket. Look at this bend, it goes all the way over. And once I saw that, I didn't see anything else, and that's why I have the big hump on the brisket. My favorite knife to use when I'm trimming a brisket is this New West Knife Works knife that's made in the USA. Right here you can see why. It just glides through the brisket. And while I was trimming my brisket, the alert went off on the Weber Searwood, and it is now up to temp. And as you can see here, it didn't take very long at all. Now, while trimming the brisket, I want to try to get the hump a little flatter, and that's why I am dissecting this decal fat out. Because if I can get some of that out, I feel the brisket will lay flatter and cook more evenly. And here's what I got. Here's what the meat side looks like, and then here's what the fat cap looks like. And now let's season the brisket. I like to start on the meat side of the brisket because I'm going to cook this brisket fat side up. And then once I have the meat side finished, I'll go ahead and just flip that over onto a rack, trying not to knock off any of the rub that I've applied. Now, once I flip that over, I'm going to push the flat in on itself to make it a little thicker and perky. Now all I have to do is season the fat cap. Since the meat side and the edges have already been seasoned, all I have to do now is season the fat cap. Now that we've seasoned our brisket, let's get it on the Weber Searwood. So it's only 10:49, so we did that pretty quick. And just for easy timekeeping, we're going to call this 11 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get the brisket on, and you can see in the pellet grill, it's laying nice and flat. As the last thing for the pellet grill, I'm going to get about 1.5 cups of water and add that to my slow and sear baskets. Now I'm using that for something it probably wasn't designed for, but it's the water trough that goes right in between the slow and sear baskets, and I have no idea if they're selling those separately. So you may be asking yourself, why didn't I put in the internal temperature thermometer? I didn't forget about it. I'm just not going to do that until after I wrap the brisket. In the meantime, I'll monitor it with my pen thermometer. So the brisket is on, and now we just need to monitor our cook. It's 1 o'clock. Our brisket has been on for about 2 hours. It's time for our first spritzing. Now, since I have that water trough in, I really don't need to do this, but I like to do it. So we're going to do it anyway. When you're spritzing, make sure you get as much coverage as possible. All right, we're done spritzing. Now let's get the lid closed. And as you can see, it is still 1 o'clock, and that's because we're in, we're out as fast as possible. I'll let this go for another 2 hours. It's 3 o'clock. Let's spritz our brisket again. We don't have any time to admire this thing. Just close the lid, and as you can see, I was in and out as quickly as possible again. Now it's 4 o'clock. We're going to spritz our brisket again and check the temperature. So we'll get the lid open, and my Typher Instaprobe was handy, so I grabbed that. It's reading about 138 degrees. So we're actually moving along quite nicely. I'll go ahead, get the brisket spritzed, close up the lid, and you can see it's only 4:01. All of that does not take a long time. It is 7 o'clock. Let's go ahead and spritz our brisket. And if you remember, this is where I dug out some of the decal fat and it kind of expanded. I don't particularly like that, but it's what happened and we're going to go with it. Now let's talk about the beauty of a pellet grill. So I'm going to go ahead, do a few things, and get my wrapping station ready. I have to get ready and go to a graduation party. So I've spent all the time I could on this brisket up until now. It's now 7:28 and almost time to leave, so it's time to wrap this brisket. First, I want to do a quick temperature check, and it's coming in at about 160 degrees of internal temperature. When I wrap my brisket, I like to spray the paper down with a little bit of water, and that's just going to make this a little easier to fold. I'll then get my brisket on, and now I'll just wrap it. I want to make sure all the edges are covered and the fat side remains up. Now, if you remember, this is where I dug out some of that decal. So since it was facing forward, when I put it back on to the pellet grill, I want it facing backwards, essentially rotating my brisket for an even cook. I'll go ahead and spray the wrapping paper one last time. Now I'll get the Weber thermometer and kind of measure it out to where it looks like it's in the center of the thickest part of the brisket. And then once I feel like I found it, I can then insert it. We're ready. Just close the lid, and we're just gonna let this thing go until tomorrow morning. So we have our brisket on, and even though I'm not at home right now, using my Weber app, I'm still monitoring my brisket and checking on how far along that internal temperature is coming. One of the interesting things about the internal temperature is you can see right here, the temperature actually dropped over the course from 7:30 to 8:30 and then started to rise again. And then at about 10:02, it wasn't progressing as much as I would have liked. So I went ahead and raised the temperature from 230 to 235. Now that 5-degree difference isn't going to make a lot of difference in an hour or two, but over the course of the next 10 to 12 hours, it might knock off 30 to 45 minutes of cook time. And then the last thing I did from my app was set a temperature alert. And I went ahead and set that alert to 190 degrees because that's where I wanted to start checking for tenderness. I refilled my pellets, and I'm not going to mess with this thing until I wake up the next morning naturally, or if my alert goes off. I woke up naturally and it's the next day, so let's check on our brisket. It's 8:30 in the morning, and just to double check the internal temperature, and this thing was already feeling tender. I was quite shocked because the temperature is only reading 185 degrees. I'll admit that 185 degrees and a brisket that's pretty tender like it is quite unusual. I let it go another 30 minutes, and then around 9 o'clock I decided to check again, and this time I'm going to use another thermometer because honestly I'm not believing what the other two thermometers are saying. So we invited the Thermopen 1 to the party. So we're going to check it again, and then with the Instaprobe, it's only reading about a degree or two higher than it did 30 minutes ago, but it is feeling extremely tender. It is actually feeling like it's done. And then when I double check, I guess this is actually triple checking the other two probes, the Thermopen 1 is also reading about the same temperature, and I am still quite surprised. When all else fails, let's go with our senses and just feel the brisket. So I pick it up from the center and feel what kind of flex it has, and it is super tender. I'll pick it up from the flat end to see what the bend feels like, and it is super tender. Even though the temperature is reading 188 degrees, I'm gonna call this brisket done. So we're gonna pull it off and we're gonna let it rest, and I like to use my chill chest to do that in. All right, so we're either going to be good or not. I'm gonna get my brisket, put it in the chill chest, and then set it right back on my counter to let it rest until about 1 o'clock, because that's all the time I have to let this rest. It is now 9:12. We're going to get almost 4 hours of rest, which should be good enough. Here we go. Our resting period is over, and it's time to check out our results. We let this rest, and our resting temperature is 135 degrees. Now, I decided to do as little editing as possible, just so you can see how this brisket comes out of the wrapper without any cuts. So let's carefully cut the wrapper off, and then we'll just pull it apart. Try not to waste any of those juices, so if there's something dripping, drip it onto the brisket. Now let's go ahead and pull this out and check this out. Look at that brisket. The first thing I notice on this brisket is that incredible bark. And look at all of that drip. Man, the thing looks incredible. Now, personally, I think this is super dark, super rich, and I don't really see this coming off of other pellet grills. Now get it back onto the board, and whatever juices or fat renderings are still in the wrap, just pour that right on top of your brisket. Now, I almost forgot to give you a time update. It is 1 o'clock. Perfect timing. We'll start off by cutting this right down the center, just so you can get that money shot. Cut it straight through, stack it up, and that's for drama, and so that you can see all that juice dripping out. Now we're going without any cuts. So let's position the brisket, and I couldn't decide which angle to cut it from, and settled on this one. And at 188 degrees, just look at that brisket fold over on itself. This brisket is absolutely done at an extremely low temperature. Of course, a little pit master privilege. And now this slice, I'm trying to pick it up to show to you, but it's just not happening. It's way too tender. It's difficult to handle. If I were to pick it up on one side, it would fall apart. So maybe technically it's overdone a little bit. Now, I did feel a little bit of drag on that cut, so I'm going to resharpen my knife because I used it to cut through all that paper. So now we'll just take some slices off, and you can see some of these slices are going through nicely, and some of these slices are literally falling apart, which to me at 180 degrees is still quite incredible. So we'll keep slicing, and then eventually I'll work my way through to the flat. Which usually tends to be just a little bit drier, and the meat holds together a little bit better. And you can see on this slice, we got the bend that we look for, and the flat is still very juicy. All right, so there's the flat side. Okay, so let's continue and cut through the flat, and I'll show you a couple more pieces here and there until I get all the way to the end to what, for me, is the best bite of this entire brisket, and that is the brisket tip right here. It's the most dry piece. It has the most smoke ring and the most bark, and the flavor is as intense as it gets on a brisket. It's totally delicious. Now that we've worked our way through the flat, let's go ahead and cut the point into cubes. We'll just cut that perpendicular to the original cut, and let's just stack it up again and give you another money shot. Now we won't go through this whole point, but I did want to show you that little flap that I created when I cut out that decal fat. Here it is. It actually created more bark, so I'm not totally unhappy with it. And then I'll cut through the flat, and then here comes that piece again. Cut that into cubes, and then I'll show you a closer look at it. Has the extra bark. It did dry out a little bit, but not so much that I think it's a waste of meat. Now, if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, hit the subscribe button. You're gonna love it. Thank you for watching View to a Grill. I'll see you guys next time. Take care, y'all.